In the early 16th century, a woman would rise from obscurity to become one of the most famous and controversial figures in English history. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and her life story is filled with intrigue, ambition, and tragedy. Join me as we delve into the historical journey of Anne Boleyn, a woman who would ultimately change the course of history. Anne Boleyn's exact birth year remains a mystery, with some suggesting 1501, while others lean towards 1507. I'm in the 1501 camp myself, but that's neither here nor there. However, historical evidence indicates that she could not have been more than 6 years old when she entered the service of Margaret of Austria in 1513, making, in my opinion, 1501 a more likely birth year.
So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view.
According to Lord Herbert of Shrewsbury, 17th century biographer of King Henry VIII, based on now lost contemporary sources, Anne returned from France in 1522, at the age of 20, which again is more evidence towards Anne being born in 1501 rather than 1507. Anne was one of 4 surviving children to be born to her parents, Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard. It is believed that Elizabeth Howard had a pregnancy every year after her and Thomas were wed, and that her last pregnancy was in 1505.
And got busy! Oh, this is just too good!
Of those children, we know the names of Mary, Thomas, Anne, George, and a 5th child named Henry, whose resting place is marked by a small brass adjacent to his father's tomb in Hever Church, so it is likely he died young. The Boleyn family roots in Norfolk traced back to the 12th century. The Boleyn children spent their early years at Blickling Hall in Norfolk, but held great significance in their upbringing. Here they learned about their family status, took their first steps, and received their first lessons. The Boleyn family name, which has had a variety of spellings, was adorned with a bull's head on their coats of arms, which was a clever play on words. It is believed that Anne may have been named after Saint Anne and was born around that saint's day on the 26th of July, or one of her many Annes in her family.
Real original.
Perhaps her aunt by marriage, Princess Anne of York, who had married her maternal uncle Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, in February 1495. The surviving Boleyn children's date of births cannot be confirmed, but historians do have an idea, and as such we can't confirm the order that the siblings were born. However, it is thought that it goes Mary, Thomas, Henry, Anne, and George. Either way, Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard were married prior to 1500, potentially 1498, if not even earlier, as it is believed that Mary was born in around 1499, although her estimated birth range can go from 1496 to 1501. The family probably relocated from Blickling Hall to Hever Castle around 1505. At the very least, they had left by February 1506. During the Real Story of Anne Boleyn documentary presented by Susanna Lipscomb, Dr. Owen Emerson states that he believed that Mary and Anne Boleyn shared a lot in common, and that they had a close and meaningful relationship, and that they were each other's equals. He said that they liked pushing each other's boundaries. Owen stated that he believed that the Boleyn children were thick as thieves, which I can easily see being as true, the way that they all rallied round Anne during her rise, and how when she fell, George and her parents pretty much went with her. But I don't know if I can submit to the idea of Anne and Mary being close. From all that I have read, the 2 sisters didn't really seem to be that bothered with each other. But I could be wrong. I wasn't there. Thomas Boleyn's career at the royal court began in 1509 when he was appointed Esquire of the Body to King Henry VII. Elizabeth Howard, their mother, played a pivotal role in their upbringing, as Thomas was often away due to his court duties. The Boleyn children received a well-rounded education, including fluency in multiple languages. As an adult, Anne's intellect, wit and skill was much commented on. She grew up to be a talented and accomplished singer and dancer, a good poet, a skilled needlewoman, a witty conversationalist, and a trendsetter in fashion. She also loved gambling, although maybe not so much as a child, playing cards, drinking wine, hunting, playing bowls, and while she was at the French court, it was noted that she shone at singing, dancing, and making music. It should also be noted that Anne was very pious, as can be seen from her Book of Hours, and the comments that she left in that. Let me know in the comments if you want a video going in depth on her book. Anne was not the only person to have a copy of this book, as Catherine of Aragon and Thomas Cromwell also had the same book. This education served Thomas Boleyn well in his role as a foreign diplomat and allowed him to maintain a far-reaching network of contacts. Thomas's ambition was clear. He aimed to secure advantageous noble matches for his children, potentially even a place in the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon. Elizabeth Howard, equally well educated, supported these aspirations. On May 11th, 1509, Thomas Boleyn performed his last duty for King Henry VII, serving at his funeral. Little did he know that his daughter Anne would go on to capture the heart of King Henry VIII, changing the course of history forever. In 1511, Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, gained prominence in King Henry VIII's inner circle. He was sent on a diplomatic mission to secure the Holy Roman Emperor's support. Thomas charmed Margaret of Austria, the Emperor's daughter. Recognising an opportunity, he boasted to Margaret of the virtues and accomplishments of Le Petit Boulon and proposed that Anne join Margaret's court as a lady-in-waiting. Margaret agreed, and Anne became one of her 18 filles d'honneur, or ladies-in-waiting. It was around 1512, although I have seen spring 1513, that Anne was sent to Mechlin to serve at the court of Margaret of Austria. Margaret expressed her appreciation, noting Anne's impressive demeanour and charm despite her youth, stating, "So presentable and so pleasant, considering her youthful age, that I am more beholden to you for sending her to me than you to me." Alison Weir suggests that Anne's purpose in this arrangement was to enhance her proficiency in French, as indicated by a letter she penned to her father during this period. Margaret gave Anne a governess, Simonette, to improve her French and insisted that all of her letters to her father be written in French.
Let's try it one syllable at a time. Okay, so repeat after me. Je m'appelle.
Pelle.
Great. Okay, faster. Je m'appelle.
Pelle.
Je m'appelle.
Mais poupou.
It's too hard. I can't teach you.
In 1513, young Anne Boleyn was in Tournai, now in modern-day Belgium. Here she witnessed a significant moment when the city presented Margaret of Austria with tapestries depicting scenes from the Book of the City of Ladies. In Margaret's court, Anne became acquainted with Christine de Pisan's works, which promoted female literacy and the empowerment of women. Pisan boldly challenged gender norms and advocated for female education. Her works questioned a woman's unhappy marriage and that men who didn't want women educated were men that were worried that the women would be smarter than them. Just as women's bodies are softer than men's, so their understanding is sharper. If it were customary to send girls to school and teach them the same subjects as are taught to boys, they would learn just as fully and would understand the subtleties of all arts and sciences. Anne spent 18 months in Margaret of Austria's court, where her father, Thomas Boleyn, arranged for her to be educated. However, her elder sister Mary embarked on a different path, sailing to France with Mary Tudor, future Queen of France, in October 1514. Despite being the younger Boleyn daughter, Anne would be given a place at court before her older sister Mary. Many have used this as evidence that actually Anne was the older of the two, not Mary. It is possible that as Mary was more accomplished at French, Thomas took the opportunity to send Anne abroad to improve her French, And what a better place than the court of Margaret of Austria, which was seen as one of the finest finishing schools in Europe. It may also rather harshly be that Thomas maybe saw more potential in Anne's intellectual abilities than Mary, and that it would be more beneficial for his youngest daughter. We have a letter written by Anne to her father while she was in Brussels, which demonstrates her struggle in grasping the French language. Unfortunately, it is undated, so we don't know exactly when this was written. However, this letter is also significant as it has been used to support the theory that Anne was born in 1501 instead of 1507, based on the handwriting. She wrote, "Sir, I understand by your letter that you desire that I shall be a worthy woman when I come into court, and you inform me that the Queen will take the trouble to converse with me, which rejoices me much to think of talking with a person so wise and worthy. This will make me have greater desire to continue to speak French well and also spell, especially because you have enjoined it in me. And with my own hand I inform you that I will observe it the best I can. Sir, I beg you to excuse if my letter is badly written, for I assure you that the orthography is my own understanding alone, while the others were only written by my hand, and Simonette tells me the letter but waits so that I may do it myself. Written at Weir by your very humble and very obedient daughter, Anna de Boleyn." It is also important to note that the Queen that Anne refers to in the letter is most likely Mary Tudor, for reasons I'll explain later. In the summer of 1514, Anne's sister Mary had been summoned to the English court to attend the 18-year-old Princess Mary Tudor as she travels to France to wed King Louis XII of France. Mary Tudor's marriage to King Louis XII of France was proposed by Thomas Wolsey as part of a political alliance. This match would then allow King Henry VIII to have a say in French politics. Mary was horrified at the match and made her brother promise that if she did this, she could choose her next marriage. Louis XII was 52 and sickly, while Mary was 18, so a second marriage for her was pretty likely. Henry VIII agreed to his sister's demands, with his fingers crossed behind his back, obviously. Savvy Thomas Boleyn saw a major opportunity for his two daughters, Mary and Anne. Anne at this point had greatly improved her French, and Mary's French was better than Anne's, well, as a child anyway. Mary's place was secured, but Anne was already in the service of Margaret of Austria. However, the Princess Mary had specifically asked for Anne Boleyn.
This is awkward.
Mary and King Louis were wed by proxy at Greenwich on the 13th of August 1514. The next day, Thomas Boleyn wrote to Margaret explaining the situation. Thomas penned a tactful request to Archduchess Margaret of Austria. He sought permission for his daughter Anne to return to England, accompanied by his emissaries. In this letter that was composed at Greenwich, to which he said, "To this request I could not, nor did I know how to refuse." The Princess Mary was deciding her entourage for France, and among her desired attendants was none other than Anne Boleyn. The Queen referred to in Anne's letter was Mary Tudor herself, now boasting a royal title after her proxy wedding. Intriguingly, the historical records contain references to an M. Boleyn among the privileged young ladies chosen to accompany Mary Tudor to France. This mysterious initial has spurred debate among historians. Was it Mary Boleyn, or possibly Mistress or Mademoiselle? The puzzle deepens as we delve into a list of Queen Mary's ladies who were compensated for their service between October and December 1514. Here we find the name Marie Boleyn, which could be a reference to Mary Boleyn. Actually, I'm almost certain it's Mary Boleyn. However, Anne's name is conspicuously absent from this list, raising questions about her whereabouts during this period. Both Anne and Mary Boleyn were destined for France, yet Anne is curiously absent from the list of English attendants who embarked on that journey with Mary Tudor from England. This raises the possibility that Anne might have taken a different route, perhaps travelling directly from Brussels. Mary's Tudor and Boleyn set sail to France on the 2nd of October 1514. On the 9th of October 1514, Princess Mary Tudor and King Louis XII of France were united in marriage at Abbeville. It was a momentous occasion, marked by opulence and grandeur. However, there was a notable absence. Where was Anne Boleyn? Historians have long wondered why Anne was not present at the wedding. The timeline suggests that there should have been enough time for Anne to return home and accompany Mary to France. Yet she did not. So what could have kept her away? One possible explanation lies in the complex world of European politics. It is believed that the Archduchess Margaret of Austria, a powerful figure in Europe at the time, may have played a role in Anne's absence. Margaret was reportedly displeased with King Henry VIII for breaking the betrothal between her nephew, Archduke Charles, and Henry's own daughter, Princess Mary. This breach of promise might have led Margaret to create difficulties for Anne's departure, effectively delaying her journey to France. Anne's absence from the pay records for the period between October and December 1514 further adds to the mystery. It is suggested that Anne arrived in France in early 1515, but pay records for the following quarter no longer survive. Delays caused by winter weather and Anne's need for a new wardrobe given her growth could have also contributed to this timing. Meanwhile, Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister, had a role to play in the grand wedding ceremony of Mary Tudor and King Louis XII. She was among the 4 chamberers whose duties included serving the Queen in the privacy of her chamber, performing tasks considered beneath the dignity of the ladies-in-waiting. Both Marys, Tudor and Boleyn, awoke an hour before dawn to prepare for the wedding. Being that it was October, it was chilly, and many wore fur-lined robes of cloth of gold, velvet, damask and silk. After the bridal procession had formed in the Queen's apartments, Anne's sister Mary and 12 other women took their place behind the new Queen of France, while being escorted by a gentleman as they followed their mistress across the gardens to the great hall of the Hotel Grutheus, where the ceremony took place, which was hung with gold. The fanfare blared as Mary Tudor, resplendent in gold brocade and jewels, entered. She was married to the antique and feeble Louis XII by the Cardinal Bishop of Bayeux. Tradition has it that a tapestry dating from around 1525 or earlier depicts the wedding ceremony. It is said that Mary and Anne Boleyn are among the female attendants portrayed in the tapestry, although their identities cannot be confirmed. Some have even suggested that a figure in a red gown might represent Anne. However, as we've already discussed, Anne wasn't at the wedding. The Dauphin François, whose ambitions were threatened by this royal union, went to great lengths to ensure that the marriage would not bear fruit. Although, if I'm being completely honest, mate, I don't think you've got anything to worry about. He even ordered someone to spy on the newlywed couple in their marriage bed.
What?
To his relief, the report came back stating that it was not possible for the king and the queen to beget children. Anne, who after the wedding was now in France, took her place in Mary's household along with her sister, Mary. On the 1st of January 1515, King Louis XII of France died during a fit of vomiting amidst a violent storm.
Gross.
The news of his death was met with a poignant scene. It is said that Queen Mary Tudor, upon hearing the news, fainted. Following this unfortunate event, a series of customary protocols and significant changes took place. In keeping with tradition, Queen Mary Tudor was required to don the traditional nun-like white mourning attire known as devil blanc, worn by French royal widows. Her subsequent days were spent in seclusion within sombre, black-draped apartments at the Hotel de Cluny. This seclusion was expected to last for the prescribed 40 days of mourning, during which she was closely watched. following orders from Louis of Savoy. The purpose of this vigil was to ensure that she was not expecting her late husband's child.
I'm watching you, Wazowski. Always watching.
Once Queen Mary emerged from her 40-day seclusion, she displayed her resilience by defying King Francois. She began to receive visitors and resumed her role in managing her household. Notably, she dismissed her French ladies-in-waiting and called upon her English attendants to rejoin her service. The Boleyn sisters, along with their fellow attendants, were asked to step aside while Queen Mary conducted private audiences, most notably with the Duke of Suffolk. In the wake of these significant events, the Boleyn sisters' lives continued to be intertwined with the French court, thanks in part to their proficient command of the French language. Their association with Francis and Queen Claude ensured their continued presence even after Queen Mary Tudor's departure. Anne and Mary Boleyn's journey to the courts of France was far from over, and their story would soon take them back to English court in the unfolding chapters of their lives. On the 1st of January 1515, the King of France, Louis XII, very rudely died, leaving the throne to his cousin and son-in-law, Francois. Although, I'm sure that Mary Tudor, Louis's widow, is jumping for joy, as she now gets to be with Charles Brandon.
Hubba hubba.
You're making me uncomfortable.
I mean, if Charles Brandon really did like this, whew! With King Francois's approval, Brandon married her heartily, in secret that February, in the chapel of the Hotel de Cluny, with only 10 witnesses in attendance. Brandon's 2 diplomatic companions were notably absent from the wedding, leading historians to speculate that Mary and Anne Boleyn might have been among those present during the ceremony. Now, I just want to say from a personal standpoint that although Pio and Henry VIII did mention about Anne being corrupted from an early age, I'm not 100% sure if that did happen. I believe that Anne was quite a pious person, and I think that she would have kept herself ready for marriage. But it's just something worth bringing up. Queen Claude was no stranger to the antics of her husband, and so kept a close eye on her female attendants. Among these attendants was Mary Boleyn, who had yielded to France's advances at an early stage. In stark contrast, Anne Boleyn resisted such temptations, instead embracing a path of dignity and grace. As one French poet, Lancelot de Carles, noted, "She became so graceful that you would never have taken her for an Englishwoman, but for a Frenchwoman born." Anne's sense of style was equally remarkable, as she effortlessly embraced the latest fashions with impeccable grace and poise. Her wardrobe choices and her fashion sense left a lasting impression on the French court, solidifying her status as a prominent figure within its glamorous circles. On the 14th of September 1515, during a campaign to secure Mila, King Francois I achieved a significant victory at the Battle of Marignano. That one. His triumph in Italy led him to a remarkable encounter with the renowned artist Leonardo da Vinci. In the course of his stay in Italy, Francois had the privilege of witnessing Leonardo's masterpiece, the fresco of the Last Supper, and even met the venerable artist himself. At this point in time, Leonardo was well into his 60s, sporting a bald head, long hair, and a distinguished beard. Now, when I say bald head and long hair, like he's bald at the top, he's got like long hair going down, I feel like Max from the Tweenies is like the best I can give you, but rather than the little short bits, it's like long. That's what I mean. In a testament to his brilliance, Francois extended an offer to Leonardo, inviting him to become the king's first painter, engineer, and architect. To the delight of the French court, Leonardo accepted the royal appointment and embarked on a journey to the north of France, bringing with him a treasure trove of his works, including the iconic Mona Lisa. By January 1516, King Francois was prepared to leave Milan and return to France. Sometime prior to his departure, Queen Claude, accompanied by the king's mother, Louise of Savoy, and sister Marguerite d'Angoulême, had journeyed south to meet the victorious monarch. Anne Boleyn would have been part of the Queen's entourage. The highly anticipated reunion between the royal ladies and the king occurred on the 13th of January 1516 in Provence. From there, they attended Francois on his triumphant progress back through France. In the same year, 1516, Leonardo da Vinci, supported by the king, took up residence in a splendid house known as the Manor of Clou, now the Château du Clos-Luce. Oh, Jesus Christ. Situated near the Château of Amboise. It just looks like Ambrose to me, like that rice pudding thing. Leonardo made occasional appearances at court, and since the 19th century, there has been speculation that Anne Boleyn was acquainted with Leonardo, possibly by sight. This conjecture is quite plausible, given her frequent presence at Amboise and Leonardo's close ties to the French court. Notably, Leonardo's residence was connected to the Château of Amboise by an underground tunnel, making it conceivable that Anne may have even had the opportunity to behold the beautiful, masterpiece, exquisite Mona Lisa. I actually thought the painting was alright. Nothing special. I've seen better. We're not really too sure what happened to the Boleyn sisters between now and 1520. It is highly likely that Anne continued on in the service of Queen Claude due to her own abilities, and her father Sir Thomas Boleyn's influence. Anne held qualities that would have been desired by both Queen Claude and her formidable mother-in-law, Louise of Savoy. Her father may have hoped that her placement there would eventually secure a wealthy and titled husband in France. Mary would eventually leave France, potentially at the beginning of 1520, as she was to wed William Carey on the 4th of February 1520 at the newly rebuilt Chapel Royal at Greenwich Palace, with King Henry VIII himself in attendance at the wedding. His attendance is a sign of his approval at the match. He may have even got involved himself. He did like to think of himself as a matchmaker. Henry then involved himself in negotiations for the marriage of Anne Boleyn later that same year, a sign that Henry hadn't eyed up the younger Boleyn sibling for himself yet. The Field of the Cloth of Gold took place from the 7th of June to the 24th of June 1520, and there is so much to talk about that I'm just going to keep it short and sweet. It was initially meant to solidify the friendship between King Henry VIII of England and King Francis I of France. But ultimately, it cost a lot of money, and it actually drove the two countries further apart.
I wish you could feel the love in this room.
I still hate you. Hate makes you ugly. Oops, too late.
After they parted, King Henry VIII pretty much went running to Charles V. So, yeah. Great success. Well done. I'm glad you spent all the money. Despite the elaborate preparations and festivities, the summit achieved little in terms of lasting peace between England and France. Henry's challenge to a wrestling match with Francis and other competitions took place, and Henry even had a lavish temporary palace brought to Calais. Among those present were Queen Catherine of Aragon, Queen Claude of France, Mary Boleyn and Anne Boleyn, who likely served Queen Claude or Margaret of Angoulême during the event. The Boleyn family played a significant role, with Thomas Boleyn proposing the meeting. Elizabeth Boleyn, Anne's mother, and her sister Mary Boleyn, now Carey, served as attendants for Queen Catherine of Aragon. Many have taken this to mean that they served Catherine at court, but this isn't the case, as it was just for this event. Anne's brother, George Boleyn, accompanied their father as part of his retinue of attendants, while Anne was the only member of the Boleyn family to be on the French side. It has been stated that, at this point, Anne had adopted a French accent after being there for 6 years, and was wearing the latest French fashions. While the event did not bring lasting peace, it left a mark on history, showcasing Henry's image as a Renaissance king. However, tensions between England and France persisted, leading to subsequent conflicts. The event's enormous expense and extravagance have led some to view it as a royal vanity project, or in my opinion, a complete waste of time. In the 1520s, Thomas Boleyn, sensing deteriorating relations between England and France, decided to bring his daughters back to England for their safety. To avoid raising suspicions with King Francis of France, Cardinal Wolsey provided a somewhat plausible reason by telling Francis that Anne needed to return home due to a potential marriage proposal, which, to be fair, did have some truth to it. Anne may have also returned home due to a family death, although I can't be sure of the exact date her elder brother Thomas died, but he did die in 1520, and this may have contributed to Anne's return to England. It wasn't long till negotiations were underway for Anne's marriage to James Butler, the son of Sir Piers Butler, who still claims the title of Earl of Ormond, much to the annoyance of Anne's father, Thomas. This suggests that Anne was the younger sister and her marriage plans were only considered after her elder sister had been married off. Regardless, the proposal was presented to King Henry, who promised to consult with Wolsey. The process took time, and actually by the end of 1522, Anne's betrothal seemed no closer. Ultimately, Anne's relationship with the king helped facilitate an agreement in 1528. Thomas Boleyn became the Earl of Ormond, and Piers Butler became the Earl of Ossory as part of the settlement. Our journey continues in February 1522, when Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, skillfully secured her a coveted position in the household of Queen Catherine of Aragon. By March 1522, Anne was officially integrated into the royal wardrobe and soon elevated to the esteemed role of a maid of honour to Queen Catherine. It wouldn't be long till Anne made herself noticed. There were presented to the eye of the court the rare and admirable beauty of the fresh and young Lady Anne Boleyn to be attending on the Queen. The 4th of March 1522 bore witness to a grand feast hosted by the influential Cardinal Wolsey at his London home, York Place, for the King and Queen. Both Anne and her sister Mary graced the occasion, and this event initiated Anne's ascent to prominence within the royal court. The assault on the Castle of Virtue, most commonly referred to as Château Vert, a large model of a castle called Le Château Vert, was wheeled into the hall, and if you haven't guessed it, yes, it was indeed green. 5 ladies and 5 gentlemen came from the castle and they danced together. Mary Boleyn played kindness. Mary Tudor was beauty. Catherine of York, Countess of Devon, was honour. Jane Parker, later Boleyn, was constancy. And rather fittingly, Anne Boleyn was perseverance. Anne would find plenty of situations in her life where she would have to persevere, although ironically, she would never dream of it at this time. All the women wore white satin gowns embroidered with gold thread. King Henry VIII had his eyes fixed on Lady Boleyn, but not Anne. It was her sister and his mistress, Mary. Not that I think Anne minded, as she was eyeing up Henry Percy, who was also in the audience. A match with Percy would have been advantageous for her, but a downgrade for him. This suggests that, on his part anyway, this was a love match. Although Anne's hatred towards Wolsey for eventually breaking off the relationship may suggest that it was also a love match for Anne as well.
I hate you like I care.
By the summer of 1523, Henry Percy, the heir to the earldom of Northumberland, had secretly proposed to Anne. The prospect of becoming the Countess of Northumberland and overseeing Alnwick Castle filled her with delight. Their secret engagement likely developed in 1523, as Percy had been stationed in the north as Warden of the East and Middle Marches since late 1522 to early 1523. However, this passionate affair faced a swift and decisive intervention. Cardinal Wolsey, aware of the budding relationship, recognised its illegitimacy, given Percy's prior betrothal to Lady Mary Talbot, dating back to 1516. In those times, a pre-contract was as binding as a marriage. Wolsey promptly informs the king, who, interestingly, revealed his own affections for Anne.
Coincidence? I think not!
The love between Anne and Percy could not have endured for long, as Wolsey likely intervened during the late summer of 1523. Although the young couple ardently desired marriage, Percy was honour bound to Lady Mary Talbot. His father was summoned to convince him to honour the existing betrothal, which had been formally arranged by September 1523. Anne, understandably consumed by resentment towards Wolsey, suffered a humiliating fall from grace and was sent home to Hever in disgrace. 1525 is the year that historians tend to believe that King Henry VIII started to pursue Anne Boleyn. She was now back at court, serving Queen Catherine, having recovered from the Percy scandal. Her sister Mary may or may not have used what little influence she had with the king while she was his mistress, although that was most likely over by this point. It's interesting to note that after Butler and Percy, the latter of which was wrapped up by 1523, her father Sir Thomas Boleyn had made no effort to find Anne a suitor, and that 2 years later in 1525, she is still single and available.
Wait a tick. That means I'm single again! Oh, behave! Yeah!
Maybe he was waiting for a valuable prize for his daughter, who knows. In early 1527, Henry proposed marriage to Anne, who sought to reassure him that Thomas Wyatt held no significance in her affections. She explained that the incident with the trinket had occurred without her consent. Anne, however, found herself grappling with the intensity of Henry's passion, particularly as he had become increasingly open with his flirtations. As a result, she fled from the royal court and retreated to Hever Castle. Ironically, this move seemed to make Henry want her more. As late spring arrived in 1527, Anne eventually accepted the king's proposal for marriage, fearing that she might lose his interest. As soon as he became available, Henry paid a visit to Anne at Hever Castle, where she initially agreed to return to court, even considering the company of her mother to safeguard her reputation. However, as Henry left, Anne had a change of heart and sent a message to Henry expressing her inability to return. This decision caused Henry some anxiety, fearing that Anne's feelings might have cooled. In his next letter, he complained about her not writing to him enough. After much pleading from Henry, Anne eventually returned to court, driven by her fear of losing his interest. Upon her return, Henry made no effort to conceal their romantic involvement. Instead, he openly showered her with gifts, including jewellery and luxurious clothing. Around this time, Cardinal Wolsey sensed the emergence of a hostile faction around Anne, although he had seemingly forgotten about the Percy affair and regarded Anne, much like Catherine, as just another of the king's mistresses who would fade away with time. But Anne had not forgotten. She was determined to orchestrate Wolsey's downfall, but first, she needed his assistance in negotiating the annulment of Henry's first marriage. While Anne maintained a cordial facade towards Wolsey and continued to participate in various court activities alongside the king, Anne was constantly in the king's company. She ate with him, prayed with him, and danced with him, but she would not share a bed with him. Many believed that Anne was responsible for sowing seeds of doubt in Henry's marriage, yet she served as more of a catalyst than the primary cause of his marital concerns. Anne was rarely seen at court between May 1527 and summer 1529. On the 22nd of June 1527, a significant moment unfolded as Henry paid a visit to Catherine's apartments to formally announce his decision to seek an annulment of their marriage. Although Catherine had already gathered this information through her network of informants, the confirmation of his intent shattered her peace of mind and her opinion of the Lady Anne. Henry asked for Catherine's cooperation and offered her the option to choose a residence for her retirement. She wept and firmly rejected Henry's proposal, carrying on as though nothing had happened between them. During the following month, July 1527, Cardinal Wolsey embarked on a diplomatic mission to France with the dual purpose of securing support for the annulment and the potential for a French alliance. Unfortunately for Wolsey, he failed on all accounts. While he was away, Anne and her faction, supposedly, manipulated Henry into believing that Wolsey was actively working to get the Pope to reject the annulment. Wolsey returned home, empty-handed, which only fueled the rumours spread by Anne and her faction about his true intentions. Now, I'm not sure what happened between Mary Tudor and Anne Boleyn, but according to Alison Weir in her book The Six Wives of Henry VIII, Dowager Queen of France Mary Tudor supported Queen Catherine, of whom she was very fond of, and she hated Anne Boleyn. So much so, she refused to come to court while she was there. Now, to me, this seems odd, considering that 13 years earlier, Mary had specifically asked for Anne to accompany her to France, although 13 years is a very long time and a lot can happen. It could just be that she has a better bond with Catherine, as Mary would have known her since 1501, and in a Taylor Swift Katy Perry fashion, she watched this go down and picked sides. Anne, who was at Hever, made a brief court appearance before returning to Hever for most of the winter. Henry and Anne exchanged gifts that New Year's Eve. Her gift to him was a jewelled ship, in which the solitary damsel is tossed about. On the 1st of January 1528, the dispensation for Henry to marry Anne was issued. Although it did not specifically mention Anne, it meant that Henry, when he was free, could take any woman to be his wife, in any degree or affinity, even the first ex illicio coitio, arising from illicit intercourse, which basically meant he could marry the sister of his former mistress, which would have been seen as incestuous. That January also saw France and England make an alliance and declare war on Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, much to the distress of the king's Spanish wife, Queen Catherine. In late May 1528, England saw the worst outbreak of the sweating sickness it had ever seen. The sweating sickness was lethal, there was no cure, and those who survived the first 24 hours could hope to live. Today, it is impossible to identify what the sweating sickness actually was, as the last case reported was in 1551. Germaphobe Henry was horrified and in a panic dismissed most of his courtiers and servants and left Greenwich Palace in London for Waltham Abbey in Essex. He took both Queen Catherine and Anne Boleyn with him. 40,000 cases were reported in London, and Waltham proved not to be the safe haven that Henry had hoped for. Anne's brother George caught the sweating sickness on around the 16th of June. He would survive. Shortly afterwards, one of Anne's maids caught the sweat, and Henry fled to Hunsdon House. He then sent Anne home to her father at Hever, as she was suspected of having been infected. Anne would succumb to the illness herself on the 22nd of June. Anne, unlike her brother-in-law William Carey, would survive. In a display of concern and affection, King Henry VIII sent his second best doctor, Dr. William Butts, to attend to Anne. But why not send Anne the best doctor? Well, that's because he saved that for himself, duh.
Pretty obvious.
But the fact that Henry was willing to risk the health of his second best doctor, who would be the best if the first died, speaks volumes about the deep significance that Anne held in his heart. It is rumoured that Anne apparently remarked that she would have died content if she had died queen, but in all honesty I do doubt that she said that. By the time Dr. Butts arrived, Anne, however, was on the mend. The king was told of the good news the next morning, that both Anne and her father Thomas were past the danger and making a perfect recovery. The sweat died out by the July and Anne returned to court. However, she left Queen Catherine's service and set up her own household near Greenwich and had her own ladies-in-waiting. Anne was now queen, all but in title. There have been rumours that Anne and Henry succumbed to their desires prior to 1532. However, there is no evidence of this. Even Eustace Chapuis, who wasn't exactly a fan of Anne Boleyn, admitted that there was no proof of adultery. Flirting and 16th century version of sexting, yes, but sex, no.
Are you saying that you don't want to get with this?
The only evidence we have of Anne and Henry being intimate before marriage is when Anne becomes pregnant with Princess Elizabeth in the autumn of 1532. We continue Anne's story in late 1528. Henry and Anne's relationship is starting to heat up, and as such, So does Anne's position at court. There's only one problem. Henry is still married, and he still has a queen. Catherine. Henry is now in the process of trying to get his marriage to Catherine annulled. Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio arrived at Dover on the 29th of December 1528 to annul Henry's marriage.
Liar!
Campeggio was actually sent by the Pope to try and delay the potential divorce/annulment proceedings for as long as possible. In all honesty, he probably had no intent of annulling the marriage, as that would upset too many powerful people. Campeggio met with Thomas Wolsey on the 9th of October, and they spent 3 to 4 hours discussing His Majesty's great matter. Unsurprisingly, Campeggio, whose aim was to keep the King and Queen together, said that the best solution would be if the King and Queen reconciled. On the 22nd of October 1528, the legate met the King at Bridewell Palace, along the Thames. Henry's reaction was pretty Henry-like.
What? Okay, fine, I'm cool, I'm fine.
Henry was furious by Campeggio's suggestion that he reconcile with the Queen. The legate proposed an idea from the Pope to persuade Catherine to join a convent. If she could be assured that her daughter's rights would be protected, it might be best for everyone if she left gracefully, avoiding further complications. The Pope could grant Henry a divorce, and the Emperor would have no grounds to object. Catherine was informed of this decision 2 days later, but refused. Henry continued to appear with Catherine in public to maintain appearances. However, in private, he seldom visited her. When he did, they often argued, and he couldn't stay long, fearing Anne Boleyn's jealousy. In November 1528, the French ambassador observed, "Greater court is now paid to Mistress Anne than has been to the Queen for a long time." Henry's shift in affection was now becoming more apparent in the public eye. The ambassador also noted, "I see they mean to accustom the people by degrees to endure her." Henry VIII extended an invitation to his subjects at Bridewell Palace. During this gathering, he emphasised the peace that had prevailed during his reign and expressed his fear of dying without a male heir, which could potentially lead to another civil war. He assured them that this was his sole motivation. He added, "If it was judged that Catherine was my lawful wife, nothing will be more pleasant or acceptable to me, for I assure you that she is a woman of most gentleness, humility, and bosomness. She is without comparison, so that if I were to marry again, I would choose her above all women." Despite his heartfelt words, Henry's speech failed to diminish the public's animosity towards Anne. On the 21st of June 1529, both Catherine and Henry had been summoned to Blackfriars for a court proceeding aimed at examining the validity of their marriage. By this point, Catherine was well aware that the court was not in her favour, as Henry had pretty much already chosen Anne Boleyn to be his second wife. In a dramatic moment, Catherine knelt before her husband and implored him to halt the proceedings. When he refused, she declared her intention to appeal from the 2 cardinals to Pope Clement VII in Rome, saying, "I most humbly require you, in the way of charity and for the love of God, who is the just judge, to spare me the extremity of this new court, until I may be advised that way and order my friends in Spain will advise me to taken. And if ye will not extend to me such impartial favour, your pleasure then be fulfilled, and to God I commit my cause." After Catherine's speech at Blackfriars, Henry remained silent, staring past his wife. Once she had left, he proclaimed Catherine had been as true, as obedient, and as comfortable a wife as I could in my fantasy wish or desire. He considered himself fortunate to have had such a queen, and emphasised that no fault in Catherine had moved him. He believed that his legitimate sons had all died as a punishment from God. Henry's primary concern was his succession, and he asserted that he had not started these proceedings out of any personal dislike for Catherine's person or age. He stated that he would be content to continue the marriage if it were within God's law. With the world's eyes on her, Catherine put forth a compelling performance. As far as what she could do, she played an absolute blinder. However, it ultimately proved insufficient. As Pope Clement procrastinated, Henry began parliamentary efforts to distance his kingdom from Roman jurisdiction. In 1532, he appointed Thomas Cranmer as the new Archbishop of Canterbury, who, on the 23rd of May, 1533, annulled Henry and Catherine's marriage. By then, Catherine's fate as queen had already been sealed, as Henry had secretly married Anne in November 1532. It took 6 years to fully separate from Catherine. For the first 3 years, Henry held out hope that Rome and the Pope would eventually grant his request, as he and his council could not initially see an alternative solution. Cardinal Wolsey was starting to fall from the king's favour, and during the autumn of 1529, Eustace Chapuis assumed the role of the new Spanish ambassador. Chapuis was a staunch supporter of the emperor and had no reservations about expressing his opinions. The courtiers of the king and the faction aligned with Anne Boleyn harboured strong dislike for Chapuis and were apprehensive about his influence. The sentiment was mutual, as Chapuis never referred to Anne Boleyn as anything other than the concubine or the lady. In October 1529, rumours circulated that Anne Boleyn had influenced King Henry VIII to arrange a marriage between his daughter, the Princess Mary, and the son of the Duke of Norfolk, Henry, Earl of Surrey, who was the brother of Mary Howard. This proposed union would solidify Anne's control over Princess Mary, who was the king's sole legitimate child, and until the birth of a legitimate brother, the heir to the throne. It would also ensure that no foreign suitor could lay claim to the princess or England in the future. During the same month, a significant development occurred as Wolsey was stripped of his position as Lord Chancellor of England, and the king demanded that he surrendered the Great Seal. In an effort to appease the king, Wolsey relinquished York Place and most of his other properties. King Henry renamed York Palace as Whitehall Palace, and it was refurbished as a residence for Anne, providing her with a home and court separate from Catherine. According to canon law, the fact that Henry had been intimate with Anne's sister created an issue, necessitating a papal dispensation for their marriage. Historian Giles Tremlett noted the striking double standard in this situation. While Henry disputed the validity of the papal dispensation allowing him to marry his deceased brother's widow, he saw no issue with seeking a similar dispensation to marry his former mistress's sister. Despite murmurs at court, the king asserted that his desire to marry Anne Boleyn was based on justice and not rooted in any undue love.
Right.
Thomas Cranmer, a university-educated individual with a degree in divinity, argued that the case should be decided by divine law rather than canon law, rendering papal intervention unnecessary. If the divines in the university deemed the marriage invalid, then that should be the final word. This perspective resonated with Henry and marked a significant departure from tradition. Feeling politically isolated from Europe and disillusioned with the Holy See, Henry perceived himself as an outcast from a corrupt Church of Rome, even before Cranmer's influence. Now the possibility of breaking away from Rome became increasingly real. In November 1529, Henry continued to lavish Anne with gifts, but these offerings were now more like peace offerings in the midst of their turbulent relationship. Anne accused the king of making her wait, during which time she could have entered into a beneficial marriage and had children, which, ironically, if she had, it might just have saved her life. On numerous occasions, she would even threaten to leave Henry, as she did in January 1531. Fearing the loss of Anne, Henry would implore Anne's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and her father to mediate, often with tears in his eyes. In March 1530, Pope Clement VII issued a brief decree prohibiting Henry VIII from entering into a new marriage until a final sentence was delivered. In the May, another brief was issued, explicitly forbidding anyone from expressing an opinion on the matter, if motivated by bribes or other ulterior motives. This ruling effectively excluded the universities that Henry had been attempting to get support from. In September 1530, the Pope suggested the idea that Henry should have 2 wives, as this solution might cause less scandal than pursuing an annulment. Emperor Charles V had offered to launch an imperial invasion on behalf of Catherine in an effort to resolve her troubles throughout the 1530s. However, Catherine declined this offer due to her unwavering loyalty to her husband. Wolsey harboured hopes of making a triumphant return to power once the great matter was resolved, but this outcome could only materialise if it were settled in Catherine's favour, as the Queen would have been grateful. On the 1st of November 1530, Anne emerged victorious in the power struggle with Wolsey. A warrant was issued for the Cardinal's arrest, and he was taken into custody on charges of high treason. On the 29th of November, while en route to the Tower of London, Wolsey succumbed to the lingering illness that had plagued him in recent months, eventually passing away at Leicester Abbey. He had been accused of treason and ordered to travel to London, but his already ailing health took a toll and he died during the journey. Following Wolsey's death, it became evident that the Pope would not grant Henry a divorce. In response to various challenges, Henry enacted a law that declared it was high treason to slander or libel the king, queen, or his heir apparent. Wolsey was laid to rest next to King Richard III in what Chapuis rather ironically referred to as the tyrant's sepulchre. The news of Wolsey's demise saddened the king, who remarked, "I wish he had lived." Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn was jubilant and even organised a court masque titled The Going to Hell of Cardinal Wolsey. Henry found this production distasteful, but Anne's temperament was so volatile at that time that he dared not to confront her. By the late 1530s, Henry started harbouring a growing sense of resentment towards Anne. On one occasion, he didn't hesitate to remind her of the considerable debts that she owed him and the multitude of enemies he had acquired on her behalf. However, Anne remained unfazed by his remarks, casually shrugging it off. It mattered not. Nonetheless, it was clear that, as noted by the Venetian ambassador, his will still held considerable sway in their relationship. In January 1531, Pope Clement issued a brief instructing Henry to separate from Anne, put away one Anne whom he kept about him. Due to Clement's actions, Henry's respect for the Holy See was waning, and he was increasingly paying greater heed to Anne Boleyn's supporters for reform within the Church of England. Anne's attitude towards the Queen had deteriorated to the point of intense animosity by January 1531. Chapuis reported, "The Lady Anne is braver than a lion. She said to one of the Queen's ladies that she wished all Spaniards were in the sea. The lady told her such language was disrespectful to her mistress. She said she cared nothing for the Queen and would rather see her hang than acknowledge her as her mistress." In early 1531, Chapuis reported, "She's becoming more arrogant every day, using words in authority towards the king, of which he has several times complained to the Duke of Norfolk, saying, 'She is not like the Queen, who never in her life used ill words to him.'" Anne's unfulfilled ambitions and suppressed desires had transformed her into a woman with a sharp tongue, causing her to alienate many of those who had once supported her. On the 7th of February 1531, King Henry addressed Parliament, demanding that the Church of England acknowledge him as its supreme head. Parliament dared not defy the King's decree. Consequently, the Church of England would no longer recognise the Pope and would refer to him as the Bishop of Rome. England's religious principles remained predominantly Catholic, and little changed apart from the leadership. On New Year's Day in 1532, Anne Boleyn returned to the court, and was lodged where the Queen used to be, and is accompanied by almost as many ladies as if she were Queen. As mentioned earlier, during the Christmas and New Year's period of that year, Henry bestowed upon Anne a splendidly adorned room with cloth of gold and silver, along with intricately embroidered satin. And, also as mentioned earlier, Mary Boleyn was given a lavish gift from the king. Being the recipient of such a gift on this occasion strongly suggests that Mary was back at court, probably as one of Anne's vast train of ladies, and other evidence shows that she was periodically in attendance on her sister from this time, if she had not been before. In August 1532, Anne stumbled upon a crude picture of herself with her head cut off. She confided in her maid of honour, Anne Saville, expressing her unwavering determination to marry the king, and that "my issue may be royal, whatever will become of me." She dismissed the picture as nothing more than a mere bauble. Anne's animosity towards her stepdaughter Mary was as intense as her feelings towards Mary's mother. Henry was cautious not to praise Mary and kept his visits to her as brief as possible in Anne's presence, fearful of triggering her vicious temper. On the 1st of September 1532, Henry made Anne the Marquess of Pembroke. The wording in the Patent of Creation left room for speculation, notably the omission of the phrase "lawfully begotten" when referring to male heirs who might inherit the title. This omission held significant implications. It is strongly suggested that Anne had finally consummated her relationship with the king. Some even believed their sexual relations had commenced as early as the 22nd of August, coinciding with the Archbishop of Warham's death, and the subsequent appointment of Thomas Cranmer. It was a risk, but it wouldn't be long before the king could marry Anne. The ceremony in September had been arranged hastily, ensuring Anne would have both status and financial security if the king were to die suddenly. The consummation of their relationship only deepened Henry's infatuation with Anne. The Venetian ambassador marvelled at his great appetite for her. Chapuis noted that the king could not leave her for an hour. Henry claims that Anne had been corrupted during her youth at the French court, discovering that she had had some sexual experience, even if she technically remained a virgin, may have been disconcerting for Henry, especially given Anne's constant declarations of wanting to preserve her virtue until marriage. Anne's brother George Boleyn was part of her court, as was her sister-in-law Jane Boleyn, of whom Anne was quite fond of. Mary carried the mantle of crimson velvet adorned with ermine, and a coronet that Anne would place on her head after receiving the title Marquess of Pembroke. Glittering with royal jewels and clad in a matching surcoat of crimson velvet, also trimmed with ermine, Anne approached the king, knelt, and received a patent of creation. She became the first woman to receive a noble title in her own right, as women typically acquired courtesy titles by marriage. And in autumn 1532, Anne and Henry were in the midst of planning a trip to France. However, there was a significant hurdle to overcome: finding a royal lady willing to officially receive Anne. Queen Eleanor, sister of Charles V, declined the request. Henry, however, wasn't particularly keen on Eleanor receiving Anne, so there was no love lost there. Additionally, Francis' sister Margaret, who was now the Queen of Navarre, whom Anne had known and admired during her time in France, also refused to have any involvement with Anne due to her association with the religious Reformation. Without a royal lady to receive her legally, Anne could not make the trip to France. But, on the other hand, it wasn't considered safe for her to remain alone in England. As a result, Anne stayed in the English-controlled territory of Calais while Henry journeyed to the French-controlled region of France. They departed for Dover on the 10th of October. On the 11th of October 1532, just before dawn, Anne Boleyn sailed on the Swallow, along with her sister and the king, after spending the third night of their journey at Dover Castle. The weather was favourable, and their voyage to France was smooth. At 10 o'clock in the morning, they arrived at Calais, where they were greeted with a resounding royal salute. Henry and Anne then went to hear Mass at the Church of St. Nicholas, When they were finished, they retired to their lodgings at the Exchequer. The royal couple stayed there until the 21st of October, when Henry left Anne to meet Francis. On the 25th of October 1532, Kings Henry and Francis departed Boulogne, where Henry had been a guest at the French court, and they returned to Calais. Curiously, it seems that Anne and her ladies were absent from the elaborate welcome home ceremonies. This, however, did not stop Francis from sending Anne a diamond as a gift through the Provost of Paris. I definitely said that wrong. The King of France was lodged at the Staple Inn, situated on the main square of Calais, a distance away from the Exchequer Palace. On the 29th of October 1532, Henry accompanied Francois to the French border for their farewell. Due to the violent storms in the Channel, the English court remained at the Exchequer for an additional 2 weeks, affording Henry and Anne the opportunity to enjoy what was essentially their honeymoon. However, this idyllic period concluded at midnight on the 12th of November, when favourable winds enabled the king to sail back to England. Their journey took 29 hours. In 1532, Anne had already established herself as the king's first lady, despite Henry's existing marriage. During Christmas of that year, Anne discovered that she was pregnant. Meanwhile, Catherine spent Christmas of 1532 in relative isolation at Enfield. Cromwell's spies closely monitored her, and she was prohibited from communicating with Chapuis, although she attempted to do so whenever possible. On the 25th of January 1533, upon learning of Anne's pregnancy, Henry secretly married her in a turret room at York Place. The witnesses to this secret union included Anne's parents, her brother Lord Rochford, and 2 individuals described as favourites. It has been suggested that Mary Boleyn might have been one of these witnesses, but if that was the case, she would likely have been listed among the family members rather than just as a favourite. Contemporary sources do not convey the impression that she held a favoured position with Anne and the king. While it's possible that Anne would have had her sister, and perhaps her sister-in-law as attendants, there were others whom she was closer to. The favourites could have ever been gentlemen of the King's Privy Chamber, such as Sir Henry Norris, Sir Nicholas Carew, or Sir Francis Bryan. On the 12th of April 1533, Anne made her first public appearance as the Queen of England. Henry took the opportunity to flaunt his beautiful young and, more importantly, pregnant wife and queen to the entire court. She was clad in cloth of gold and loaded with the richest jewels. Anne was accompanied by 60 maids of honour and ceremonially led to Mass. The long train of her gown was carried by Mary Howard. Anne's household consisted of 200 individuals. Her sister Mary Boleyn was among her ladies-in-waiting. Her ladies-in-waiting also included her sister-in-law Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, Lady Margaret Douglas, the King's niece, Lady Mary Howard, Anne's cousin, the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk and was also the wife of Henry Fitzroy, Frances de Vere, who was also married to another cousin, Norfolk's son, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, Mary Shelton, yet another cousin, but on the Boleyn side, Elizabeth Wood, wife of Sir James Boleyn, Anne Savage, Lady Berkeley, and Elizabeth Brown, Countess of Worcester, whose testimony would help towards Anne's downfall. Other notable names included Anne Saville, Anne Gainsford, Lady Zouche, Elizabeth Holland, the mistress of the Duke of Norfolk, and one of Anne's maids of honour was Jane Seymour, and her future replacement as Queen. Seymour, like some of the other 200 people in Anne's service, had probably served Catherine of Aragon prior. We say prior because we can neither confirm nor deny whether Jane actually did work for Catherine. Anne had high expectations for her ladies. She gave them each a little book of prayers and psalms to hang at their girdles. She kept them busy sewing clothing for the less fortunate for hours on end. They were required to attend Mass daily and display a virtuous demeanour. Anne's silkwoman later claimed that she had never seen better order amongst the ladies and gentlewomen of the court than in Anne Boleyn's day. On the 23rd of May 1533, Archbishop Cranmer declared that the marriage between King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon was invalid and unlawful, and declared days later that Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was good and valid. When the Princess Mary received the news of the Privy Council and Cranmer's decision in May, which declared Anne as queen, she staunchly refused to accept anyone but her mother as the rightful queen. Her defiance not only fueled Anne's growing resentment, but also created a deep rift between Mary and her father. Anne tried to get Mary to acknowledge her as queen and even offered Mary an invite to court, and promising reconciliation with her father if Mary acknowledged Anne as queen. Mary's response was curt.
No!
What did she say?
Just talking shit!
She replied that she knew no Queen of England except her mother. However, she added that if Madame Boleyn were to intercede with the king on her behalf, then she would greatly appreciate it. Also at this time, Anne's pregnancy was public knowledge. She complained about losing her figure, but her father told her that she should thank God she found herself in such a condition.
True.
True. True.
True. True. True. True.
On the 29th of May 1533, the celebrations for Anne's coronation commenced, with a spectacular river pageant. At 3 p.m, royally garbed in cloth of gold, the new queen embarked on a barge that was originally used by Catherine of Aragon. The journey began at Greenwich Palace, where Anne and her entourage, including Mary and the other ladies, accompanied by their father and numerous noblemen, set sail along the River Thames. Their destination was the Tower of London, where tradition dictated that she would reside before her official coronation. As Anne disembarked at the Tower, she was greeted with joyful countenance by the king, and the cannon on the Tower wharf was fired in salute. On the 1st of June 1533, Anne Boleyn's momentous coronation took place at Westminster Abbey during her coronation. Anne was heavily pregnant, and as we know, bladder control is not at its strongest when you've got another human being pressing on it. So, as a result, Anne's ladies-in-waiting kept a potty nearby under a table. I mean, when you gotta go, you gotta go. For her coronation day, Anne wore a crimson velvet gown lined with ermine, beneath a purple velvet mantle. She was received by the clergy at Westminster Hall and escorted to the Abbey, where she was followed by several noblewomen, some on palfreys and others in chariots. Mary and the rest of the Queen's ladies, all wearing red robes and gowns, trailed behind her. Anne was crowned with St. Edward's crown, and she held a sceptre of gold in her right hand and a rod of ivory in her left. No other Queen consort before or since has been crowned in this way. Henry was making a really big show, and he was effectively crowning Anne as a queen regnant, just to really get the point across that Anne is the rightful queen, not Catherine. After the crowning ceremony, these ladies accompanied Anne back to Westminster Hall for the solemn feast that followed. 1533 was also the year that Parliament passed an act that allowed marriage with the sister of a former mistress. However, what this act failed to do was to stop the rumours from circulating about Henry and Mary Boleyn's affair. In that same year, several individuals were arrested for accusing the king of marrying the sister of his former mistress. In June 1533, not long after the coronation, Anne and Henry sought respite at Hampton Court Palace. Reports indicated that Anne was in good health and high spirits, and in August, 1 month before Anne was due to give birth, she caught Henry cheating.
Not a great plan.
Anne, quite rightly fuming, confronted Henry about it, and he responded that she should not look and endure as more worthy persons. She ought to know that it was in his power to humble her again in a moment. On the 7th of September 1533, Queen Anne Boleyn finally gives birth to a healthy baby girl at Greenwich Palace. The new princess was named Elizabeth after her paternal grandmother, Queen Elizabeth of York, and potentially after Anne's own mother, Elizabeth Howard. Let's be honest, the birth of the princess was a disappointment, but Henry did comfort Anne, saying, "You and I are both young, and by God's grace, the boys will follow." It's worth pointing out here that for he and Catherine, it took several tries before they had a baby that was born healthy. Henry, Duke of Cornwall, died within a few weeks, and out of her 6 pregnancies, only Mary survived. Whereas with Anne, she got pregnant quickly, and the first child she has survives. So you can see why Henry was optimistic. The Princess Elizabeth had a splendid christening in the Church of the Observant Friars at Greenwich Palace 3 days later, on the 10th of September. Neither Henry or Anne attended Elizabeth's christening. Her godparents, Archbishop Cranmer, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Dowager Marchioness of Dorset, and the Marquess of Exeter were there in their place. The Boleyns and Howards were out in full force. The Dowager Duchess of Norfolk helped carry the canopy of estate along with George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. Elizabeth was wrapped in a mantle of purple velvet, with a long train that was supported by her grandfather Thomas Boleyn. Mary Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk, carried a chrism of pearl and stone to put on the child at baptism. The only Boleyn not confirmed to have a role was the princess's aunt, Mary Boleyn, who was probably one of the many ladies and gentlemen who followed in the procession. But I think it's worth pointing out that the sister of the Queen didn't have a prominent role at either the coronation nor the christening, and this may give us a good insight into the sisters' relationship. The procession, which had over 500 torchbearers, returns the Princess Elizabeth to the Queen's apartments, where Anne, robed and lying on her great French bed with the King at her side, received her daughter joyfully and offered the guests more refreshments. The French ambassador noted that the whole occasion was so perfect that nothing was lacking. 3 months after the birth of the Princess Elizabeth, the young princess was sent to Hatfield Palace as plague had hit London. Her half-sister, the Lady Mary, would join her there to act as a maid of honour. Another person who would change households is Jane Seymour, who had previously been serving the Dowager Princess of Wales, Catherine of Aragon,
from a certain point of view.
But now she was in the household of the new Queen, Anne Boleyn. Although it's worth noting that the exact dates that Jane swapped households is not recorded, but she had by the Christmas of 1533, and actually some historians debate whether Jane even did serve Catherine, like at all, but that debate's for a different day. Margaret Pole, Lady Salisbury, who had been the Lady Mary's governess, was dismissed and replaced by 2 from the Boleyn faction, Ladies Anne Shelton and Anne Clear, who were there to spy on the Lady Mary and make her life difficult.
I'm watching you, Wazowski. Always watching.
By December 1533, Queen Anne was pregnant again, much to the royal couple's delight. Also in the December, former Queen Catherine was to be moved from Buckden to Fotheringhay. Both were cold and damp and awful for Catherine's health, and she refused to go, locking herself in her chambers. In February 1534, Anne wrote to Lady Shelton, who had still been spying on Mary, and told her to make sure that Mary was no longer using the title Princess, as that was reserved for her daughter Elizabeth. I can imagine that Mary was just as stubborn as her mother Catherine, who declared she was Queen of England until her dying breath. Anne told Lady Shelton that if she does use the princess title, to slap her face as the cursed bastard that she was. However, even if she wasn't a princess, Mary was still the daughter of the king, and Lady Shelton feared that people would think that she had poisoned her charge if she forever fell ill, which Mary did a lot. Check out my video on the ever-changing appearance of Queen Mary I, but it was reported that she looked emaciated. As a result, Lady Shelton actually began to befriend the Lady Mary. On the 23rd of March 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Succession, which, as the UK Parliament website puts it, the first Act of Succession passed in 1534 required Henry's subject to accept the King's marriage to his second wife, Anne Boleyn, as undoubted, true, sincere, and perfect. This act also removed the Princess Mary from the line of succession and legitimised any children from Henry's marriage to Anne so that they could inherit the throne unchallenged. Unfortunately for Anne, in June 1534, she lost the child that she was carrying. It was born a month prematurely, but it's unknown whether it was stillborn or if the baby died soon after it was born. It is thought that Henry's affair with Jane Seymour may have started in or around 1534, and the baby wasn't the only thing that Anne had lost. Her influence with the king and his love, unfortunately, the loss of the baby is what made her realise this fact. It may have been out of desperation to conceive again, but Anne thought she was pregnant again in the September. However, Chapuis confirmed on the 23rd that the lady is not to have a child after all. Anne's unhappiness was only made worse that autumn, or fall for my American viewers, when her sister Mary appeared at court, noticeably pregnant.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity and the gumption.
Her sister's betrayal was a cruel reminder of her own recent failings. Anne banished her sister from court, not just for being pregnant, there was also a secret marriage scandal as well, and it'd be like 3 months till they would actually make contact again. But the main thing is that Mary had actually remarried without asking the permission of their father, the king, or Anne, who, as queen, was effectively the head of the Boleyn family. Mary had done it regardless and apparently had not thought of the scandal her marriage could bring and how it may darken Anne's reputation. As the Queen's sister, she should have been available for the royal couple to make an advantageous marriage, so the royal couple had every reason to be angered by this. Anne seemed to be more angry with her sister than the king. Is it because of her pregnancy? Mary would write to Cromwell and beg him to help her recover favour with the king and queen. I don't think Anne and Mary had ever been particularly close, but Mary ended her letter like this. For well I might have had a greater man of birth, but I assure you, I could never have had one that loved me so well. I had rather beg my bread with him than be the greatest queen christened.
Okay. Shady bitch.
Obviously, Anne read the letter, and let's just say that didn't go down very well. John Hale mentioned that the Queen's grace might not suffer to be in the court, so it's highly unlikely that the sisters ever reconciled. In hindsight, though, I wonder if Anne wished she had. It might have been good to have another ally. And as if that autumn couldn't be any worse for Anne, her husband Henry was pursuing an unnamed woman only ever referred to as the very handsome young lady, or the imperial lady, due to her political sympathies. It is thought, as was many of Henry's extramarital affairs, that the imperial lady was one of his wife's ladies-in-waiting. However, this did not mean that she was loyal to Anne. In fact, she allegedly refused to pay honours to the Queen and showed much support to the Lady Mary. Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis noted on the 27th of September that the king had renewed and increased the love he formerly bore to another very handsome young lady of the court, and whereas the royal mistress, Anne Boleyn, hearing of it, attempted to dismiss the damsel from her service. The king has been very sad and sent her a message to this effect, that she ought to be satisfied with what he had done for her, for, were he to commence again, he would certainly not do as much. She ought to consider where she from, and many other things of the same kind. Yet no great stress is to be laid on such words. With the help of her sister-in-law, Lady Jane Rochford, Anne tried to dismiss this new rival of hers, but ultimately failed, and she felt the full force of Henry's wrath in the process, and poor Jane was banished from court. In hindsight, maybe she should have done what Catherine had done, and waited it out, as 6 months later Henry had tired of his imperial lady. And just to finish the year on a high note, because 1534 has been such a good year for Anne Boleyn, at Christmas, her favourite dog, Perquoy, who had been a gift from Lady Lisle, died.
Why, God, why?
Anne was a great dog lover, and it was Henry who had to break the news to his wife, as no one else dared. At this point, Anne and Henry, despite being together for years, had been married for only 2, and she had so far failed to provide him a male heir. She, in his eyes, was no better than Catherine. Anne had, by all accounts, become arrogant, vain, and her public displays of emotion and volatile temper was embarrassing traits that weren't desirable for a queen. Hopefully, the new year of 1535 would bring happiness to Anne. Yeah, no, 1535 would be the year that John Hale, Vicar of Isleworth, and no friend to Anne, claims that the King's Grace had meddled with the Queen's mother. Henry himself would deny this allegation, while simultaneously admitting to his affair with Mary Boleyn, and unsurprisingly, this rumour was spread to discredit Anne. Hale was a supporter of Catherine and wanted to bring into question the legality of Henry and Anne's marriage. This wasn't the first time that Anne had to face rumours being spread about her, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Instead, she turned her focus onto her ward and nephew, Henry Carey. She hired celebrated French humanist and poet Nicolas Bourbon as his tutor on the recommendation of Dr. Butts, the king's physician. Now, this is a bit controversial, but Anne would go on to tell Henry that in her dream, God told her that it would be impossible to conceive a child while Catherine and Mary lived. Apparently, she said that they were traitorous rebels who deserved to die. I mean, I know she was getting a bit desperate, but a bit harsh, Anne, come on. Just stick them in the Tower of London and throw away the key if you're that concerned. Fortunately, Henry failed to be manipulated, but this was also another major blow to Anne, as this failed manipulation was just another sign of her diminishing power over her husband. He had also taken up a new mistress. This didn't seem to last long, as on the 25th of February 1535, Chapuis reported that the young lady who was lately in the king's favour is so no longer. There has succeeded to her place a cousin of the concubine, daughter of the present governess of the princess. Anne at this point knew she could not stop Henry's affairs, so she tried to control who he had affairs with, putting forward her cousin Madge Shelton, in the hopes of using Madge and her familial connections to regain her own favour with the king.
Not a great plan.
The affair didn't last long. Not sure why it came to an end, but I do know that Anne got jealous despite being the one that arranged it.
Say what?
And the affair was so short that it did nothing to improve her relationship with her husband. By mid-March, finally some positive news for Anne, as she was visibly pregnant again. No more is known about this pregnancy, so it's safe to say that it ended as either a stillborn or a miscarriage at the end of June. Queen Anne, as we know, was a Protestant, so for those who embraced the Lutheran faith, she had become a beacon of hope, and they believed that she shared their views. I can tell you now she didn't, but she did try and influence the king to be tolerant with heretics. So you can see why they thought this, especially when Anne's intervention had saved some from persecution. Maybe it's because she could feel that she was unpopular, or she was trying to improve her image as a better and more pious queen. But towards the end of Anne's life, she was rarely seen in public without a book of devotions in her hand to try and create this image of herself as a godly matron. Information like this is what really intrigues me about Anne Boleyn, as she is known to have a bad temper, manipulative, be brash at times, and yet there is this other side of her. The side where she aids poor scholars, provides money for their education, and as far as we know from 1532 until pretty much her end, she did charity work and supported many charities, and she encouraged her ladies to do the same. On the 22nd of June 1535, the Catholic bishop John Fisher was beheaded, and as he and fellow Catholic Sir Thomas More, who was executed later on the 6th of July, refused to take the oath of supremacy and accept Henry as the head of church, it is said that it was Anne who was pushing Henry to execute the men. Chapuis noted, "When the lady wants anything, there is no one who dares contradict her, not even the king himself." Which, to an extent, is true. But we know that Anne's influence with Henry was fading. The main reason he granted her wish... Oh, hang on, I've just made Henry VIII sound like a genie, but okay.
What do you need?
See, the thing is, Anne was pregnant, and as she had already lost a baby since Elizabeth, he didn't want to do anything to stress her out and harm the baby, as when Henry does not want to do as she wishes, she behaves like someone in a frenzy. The sad thing about the execution of Bishop Fisher was that he was 76. He could have just rotted in the Tower. There was no need for that. His and More's execution did not go down well, and Anne was blamed probably for both of their deaths, but more so for Fisher's. So when Anne's pregnancy resulted in a stillbirth, it was all hushed up. So imagine the backlash if she had convinced Henry to execute Mary and Catherine, followed by her stillbirth. When Anne wasn't busy trying to get people executed or helping charities, she would often visit her daughter at Eltham or Hatfield. So she must have been delighted in the July when she and Henry were able to enter negotiations with King Francis I of France for a marriage between the Princess Elizabeth and his third son Charles. This was a shun to Mary supporters, as she was seen as the next in line to many, despite the law saying otherwise, and her marriage should have been arranged first. On the 4th of September 1535, the King and Queen stayed at Wolfhall in Wiltshire, the family home of Henry's next wife, Jane Seymour, who he would marry within the next 12 months.
Coincidence? I think not!
Right, Bernie.
Don't Bernie me! This little rat is guilty!
Despite what Bernie thinks, there is no evidence to suggest that Henry and Jane's relationship started here. The royal couple would stay with the Seymours for 6 days. Now, with the power of hindsight, we know that Anne's days are drawing to a close, but obviously she didn't know that yet. However, Anne could sense danger from all sides. Henry's affairs, the Lady Mary, and, more importantly, the woman she had replaced, Catherine of Aragon. Anne believes that all the time Catherine lived, her own existence was on shaky ground. She is my death, and I am hers. The true irony was the fact that Catherine was in fact Anne's saviour, as Henry would not cast her aside all the time Catherine lives, otherwise that would mean he made the wrong choice. Thankfully for Anne, she was pregnant yet again by November. This would be her last chance to provide the king a male heir, as Henry's tolerance for his wife was limited, and even if she didn't know it, Anne was feeling the pressure, as she apparently suffered with depression during the first few months of her pregnancy. Her mental state was not helped by Henry and Jane's relationship and the king parading his new mistress. Anne also tried to get Catherine and Mary executed, again, this time out of fear for the threat they posed herself, Elizabeth, and the unborn baby. But Catherine's health was steadily declining, and Henry thought it was best to leave her be. On the 1st of December that year, Anne thought that Catherine might recover from her illness. Anne begged yet again for the two women's death, but Henry again ignored her pleas. The English ambassador to Spain reported that people expected to hear every day of the execution of Queen Catherine, and the Princess Mary was expected soon to follow her. That December, Anne went to Sion Abbey, presumably to see her ward and nephew Henry Carey, who was studying here at the time, and check on his progress. And while she was here, she didn't miss the opportunity to lecture the nuns about their Catholicness. On the 30th of December 1535, Catherine of Aragon's health was really bad, and in the next few days, Catherine would be joined by her friends Eustace Chapuis and Maria de Salinas. Catherine would die on the 7th of January 1536, at the age of 50. Chapuis informed Henry of her death, and he rejoiced, and Anne declared, "Now I am indeed queen." That is, of course, prior to her then being accused of poisoning the former queen. Now you could argue that Anne's downfall started at various points. The minute she married Henry, when she gave birth to a girl and not a boy. You could pick any point in her life, but I am going to start at the catalyst point, and that's when Catherine of Aragon died on the 7th of January 1536. Prior to this, Anne had been realistically untouchable, but Catherine was her protector, without Anne even really knowing it. With Catherine gone, Henry was now free to get rid of Anne. The 29th of January 1536 marks Catherine's funeral. Henry donned a black attire, while Anne wore yellow again. Meanwhile, Anne was grumbling as the topic of the day revolved around the dead Catherine and not her and her pregnancy.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity, and the gumption.
Later that afternoon, a pregnant Anne stumbled upon Jane Seymour seated on the king's lap, which sent her into a frenzy. Henry, alarmed by Anne's distress and anxious for the child's well-being, dismissed Jane from the room, attempting to console Anne with soothing words. "Peace be, sweetheart, and all shall go well with thee," he assured her. However, it was too late, as that evening Anne suffered a miscarriage of a male fetus. Chapuis recorded this event, stating, "She has miscarried of her saviour." The king, disappointed and sorrowful, remarked, "I see that God will not give me male children." And so rumours started to spread like wildfire around the court that the king was looking to take a new wife. According to some accounts, Anne's miscarried child was believed to have physical deformities, a notion that was viewed as evidence of maleficence in the minds of the 16th century. Philippa Gregory, in the BBC documentary The Last Days of Anne Boleyn, explained the significance. Anne miscarries a baby, and it is inspected by a midwife, who says it's a boy, but it's malformed. Now that's of enormous importance. The belief was in the medieval world was that if a woman gave birth to a deformed or malformed fetus, then what everybody would genuinely, thoroughly and sincerely believe is that she's done a truly awful sin, and that would be like adultery, like gross adultery, or it would be incest, or it might be witchcraft. But when she loses the baby to Henry, what he sees is conclusive evidence that his wife is not a good woman, and that this marriage is not blessed by God. And that's the least of his fears. I'm certain that he believes that. He may go further and believe that his wife is a witch. However, there is no concrete evidence to suggest anything beyond a tragic end to a normal pregnancy. In a cold and unforgiving mood, Henry entered the Queen's bedchamber, lamenting the loss of his son. Anne, already in tears, confronted him, placing the blame squarely on him. "Oh, I wouldn't do that, Anne, not a good move." In response, Henry declared that she should have no more boys by him. Anne forgot all caution and blamed Henry. Yet again, but this time dragged Jane Seymour's name into the mix and explained her outburst. "Because the love I bear you is much greater than Catherine's, my heart broke when I saw you loved others." This prompted an icy response from Henry. "I will speak with you when you are well." He then left Anne and his marriage, both physically and mentally. When he had left, Anne bravely asserted to her ladies that it was all for the best. "I shall be the sooner with child again, and the son I bear will not be doubtful like this one, which was conceived during the life of the Princess Dowager." At the end of January, the Lady Mary became ill again. Her illness was thought to have been a reaction to the death of her mother. Anne tried to rebuild her relationship with her stepdaughter by inviting her back to court. She stated that Mary did not need to carry the Queen's train and that she could walk by her side, but only if she submitted to her father's laws. Mary said no.
No!
What did she say?
Just talking shit!
It was now not a question of if, but a question of when Henry would take another wife. Anne could see this clearly, and she could see that it was Jane Seymour who had betrayed her trust. It was only now that Anne may have truly appreciated how her predecessor Catherine may have felt. Jane was a pain in Anne's behind, as the messages and gifts from the king that once went to Anne now flooded Jane instead. This disrespect hurt Anne, and only made her more jealous and shrewish. She kept an annoyingly close eye on Jane. On the 2nd of April 1536, the King and Queen gathered with the court in the Chapel Royal for the Passion Sunday sermon, which was delivered by John Skipp, Anne's personal chaplain. Skipp's topic for the day was religious reform and the dissolution of the monasteries, probably one of the most controversial issues of that time. Now, historians heavily debate whether Skipp was speaking freely or in turn for Anne, as Skipp pretty much criticised everyone who was present, particularly Thomas Cromwell, who by now was a known rival or enemy to Anne. Dr. Susanna Lipscomb suggests that just because Anne's chaplain says something doesn't mean that he's Anne's mouthpiece. However, David Starkey argues that if this sermon isn't evidence, then I don't know what is. What I will say is that as Anne's almoner or chaplain, he would have had Anne's blessing to perform this sermon. So that does not mean it was her idea, although it was highly likely. It also doesn't help that it was well known that Anne had argued with Cromwell over how the proceeds of the dissolution should be spent. She thought they should go towards education and charities rather than her and Henry's pockets. But I will leave you to make your own decisions. It was also in that April that Cromwell informed Henry of his suspicions of Anne. Cromwell was intent of accusing Anne of such a crime that she would be divorced. It was a big risk coming to Henry to present this evidence, as Anne, like her or loathe her, was still Henry's wife and queen. But Henry, who was spurred on by the thought of Jane being her replacement and for a Spanish alliance, which, to be fair, apart from the lack of children, was basically what he had when Catherine was queen, Henry was probably also quite spiteful about the fact that Anne had promised him a prince, and yet so far she'd only delivered one princess. As such, he took Cromwell's allegations against his wife at face value, on the condition that he provide more supporting evidence. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Let's be honest, Henry believed these allegations against Anne because they were convenient. It just aligned with what he wanted. A few weeks later, on the 18th of April 1536, Anne's favour swung. Henry and Anne were at the chapel at Greenwich Palace. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who notably disliked Anne, had arrived to arrange peace terms with the king. He had been friends with Catherine of Aragon, and as such had never recognised Anne as queen. He had even refused to meet her in person. Henry and Anne were sat in the royal pew, which was above the chaplain, and they came down the narrow staircase where Chapuis was. Anne and Chapuis had come face to face, and as Anne passed him, he was forced to bow. In bowing to Anne, Chapuis was acknowledging their marriage on the behalf of the Holy Roman Emperor. The thing that strikes me about this is that this interaction would most likely, without a doubt, have been staged by Henry for Chapuis to have to bow to Anne. To which I have many questions. Does that mean he had forgiven her most recent miscarriage? Was Anne back in favour? Was he championing her as his queen again? Was her future arrest premeditated or on a whim? It just seems odd to create this event and then arrest her 2 weeks later, if that is what he was planning at this stage. After he bowed, Anne graciously sank into a deep reverence, as his approval showed hope that Emperor Charles V, the nephew of her rival Catherine, was potentially willing to acknowledge her as queen. But Chapuis was disgusted and ashamed of having bowed to her, to the extent that he did not attend the dinner that evening. Cromwell, on the other hand, had retired to his house at Stepney because he was ill. He would be ill for 2 weeks. This was his chance to collect as much evidence against the Queen as possible. Now, again, this is where I can't read Henry's mind, and I really wish I could, because on the 23rd of April, 1536, when Cromwell returned to court, Henry was acting like he had no idea of what was going on in the background, and even wrote to the ambassador of Rome saying, "God will send us heirs male by our most dear and most entirely beloved wife, the Queen." Okay, Henry, what you playing at? 3 days later, Anne sensed that something was wrong and made, in hindsight, the right decision of charging her chaplain Matthew Parker with the care of her precious daughter Elizabeth. One of Cromwell's spies informed him that the Queen had let courtiers into her chamber at undue hours. These men, you may already be able to guess, were George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, William Brereton, and Mark Smeaton. Anne was well known for flirting and encouraging admiration, but you have to remember that Anne practically grew up in the French court, and that was their way of doing things. She had been taught the ways of courtly love, where a knight could court a woman far above his status, wear her colours at a tournament, compose songs and poems, and to an extent, pursue her. Although that did normally end in sex. But Anne had self-control. She kept Henry at bay, until she didn't, and got pregnant. But, that was still like 7 years she said no. Cromwell, on the other hand, had all that he needed. He charged Anne with adultery with the 5 men and conspiracy to murder the king. She was also charged with incest with her brother. This last charge was added on due to what George's wife, Jane Boleyn, had said in court. It is believed by some that this was a malicious attack from Jane, who was allegedly jealous of Anne and George's close bond. But I'm not convinced. I'm also not convinced that Anne was A, desperate enough to have sex with her brother in order to conceive. She has proven that she is fertile and can get pregnant easily. And B, she knew she had enemies everywhere, and how her position in the king's favour kept swinging. I don't think she would try and jeopardise this with an affair. Also, she would be risking her position by plotting to kill the king, as her enemies would be out for the kill without his protection. Cromwell is a prime example, and that's with Henry being around. Imagine if he wasn't. On the 29th of April, Cromwell finally presented his evidence to Henry, who flew into a rage. Again, is this genuine rage? I'm not too sure.
I want to believe you.
When he had calmed himself, he gave the order for the arrest of Anne and those 5 men. The next day, Anne's musician Mark Smeaton was interrogated for 24 hours, and notably, he is the only man of the 5 to admit his guilt. But he was tortured into a confession, and he was also the only man who wasn't a noble, as torture as a way to get a confession was not to be used on the nobility. So the fact that he is the only one to plead guilty doesn't surprise me.
Coincidence? I think not!
A charge of adultery wasn't enough for Anne to be executed. Normally, a woman who was convicted of adultery, because remember it was fine for the men to have affairs, mistresses, a woman would be sent to a convent. But Cromwell was gunning for a death sentence, so he had to try and create the worst charge possible, an act of high treason, plotting the king's death. Henry was paranoid, so actually convincing Henry that men in his court were plotting to kill him would not have been too hard for Cromwell to pull off. At 9 a.m. on Tuesday the 2nd of May 1536, Anne Boleyn was watching a favourite pastime of hers, and also the king's, real tennis at Greenwich. Anne was partial to gambling and expressed regret at not placing a bet on the winner. As she does so, a messenger arrives and gives the Queen a message from the King, who was currently at Whitehall. She is told that she is to present herself to the Privy Council, who were also in Greenwich. Anne's time was limited. Chapuis reported that the King was looking for a younger wife, who we know will be Jane Seymour. It's the joy and pleasure a man feels in getting rid of a thin, old, vicious horse, in the hope of getting soon a fine horse to ride.
Gonna need a sensu for that one.
At 9:30, Anne is escorted from the tennis courts at Greenwich to the Privy Council meeting. unaware of what she's done wrong. 15 minutes later, she was greeted by the Constable of the Tower, William Kingston, Sir William Fitzwilliam, Sir William Paulet, and her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, all of whom were grim-faced. Anne would later recall how, "I was cruelly handled at Greenwich, with the King's Council, with my Lord of Norfolk," and then he said, "Tut, tut, tut," shaking his head 3 or 4 times. Now, I don't like the Duke of Norfolk, but the way he tuts at Anne like a naughty child, with the foresight of what happens next, actually makes my skin crawl. Unfortunately, this was his slimy way of distancing himself from his niece. He would play the same game with his other niece, Catherine Howard. They charged her with having committed adultery with Norris, Smeaton, and one other man who was not at that time named. At 11 o'clock, Anne was back in her apartments at Greenwich under armed guard. Although she had been charged, she had not been arrested. So she continues her normal routine and has dinner, although I guess it's more like lunch. Don't forget, Anne is still queen, for now, so she sits under a canopy of state, expressing her authority, and she wore a red velvet gown and a cloth of gold. Despite everything, Anne is trying to keep up appearances. However, I can only imagine how unnerving it was for her as she looked around and saw that her ladies were tearing up. Anne was an intelligent woman. I can imagine that by the end of her meal, she knew that this was Cromwell's doing. At 1:45, Cromwell entered the dining room with a large entourage, which included Uncle Norfolk, but now he had a scroll in his hand. This was Anne's arrest warrant. I'm sure it's not a surprise when I say that Anne and Norfolk's relationship was not the best at this moment. Anne rose from her seat and asked the men why they had come, not knowing that her uncle was carrying her arrest warrant. Norfolk responds, "We came by the King's command to conduct Anne to the Tower of London." Now, like or loathe her, one thing you cannot take away from Anne is how she handled the situation. Apart from her moments of hysteria, she remained calm and composed. She replied, "If it be His Majesty's pleasure, then I am ready to obey." Anne is to leave Greenwich. She wasn't allowed to pack, as she was told everything she would need would be at the Tower. She couldn't summon her ladies, or even say goodbye to her daughter, Elizabeth. Cromwell was desperate to get this done as quickly as possible. Anne and Henry had always had a turbulent relationship, fiery arguments, and passionate make-ups. Anne had to be gone before Henry had time to change his mind. So where was Henry? He was 10 miles away at Whitehall, and it was reported that he was in great spirits. His court at Whitehall was lively. There were feasts and banquets, and eyewitness reports say that he has daily gone out to dine here and there with ladies, and sometimes has remained with them until after midnight. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, Anne is escorted from her apartments at Greenwich down to the Thames, and leading the way was none other than Thomas Cromwell. Probably the last person she wanted to see. There was a barge waiting for her at the beach to take her to the Tower. Fun fact, the original Tudor pier still survives today, and Anne Boleyn would have boarded the boat from that pier. So next time you're in London, pop over to Greenwich and see if you can see it. It was customary for prisoners to have been taken to the Tower at night time. However, Anne is taken during broad daylight for everyone to see, just another way for Henry and Cromwell to inflict humiliation on her. Cromwell also boards the boat with Anne on what must have been the most awkward 2-hour boat ride ever. Anne arrives at the Tower of London at 5:15. Prisoners would normally be escorted through Traitor's Gate, but as Anne was still Queen of England, albeit not for very long, she was brought through Court Gate as recognition of her rank and status. When Anne enters the Tower, cannon fires sound, so the King in Whitehall can hear that she has been taken in. This next bit is one of the few times Anne's composure breaks. The sound of the cannons must have triggered something, as when she arrived, she had to be assisted from the barge and up the steps. She then fell to her knees, praying to God for his help, as she was not guilty of her accusement. She then begged the council members around her to beseech the king's grace to be good unto her. Anne acknowledges that the last time she was here, she was received with greater ceremony, as it was her coronation. She then asks William Kingston if she will be going to the dungeons, to which he responds, "No, madam. You shall go into the lodgings you lay in at your coronation." Don't know if Kingston had a Cockney accent, but that's how I'm imagining him in my brain. "All right, governor." Anne declared, "My God, bear witness, there is not truth in these charges. I am as clear from the company of man as from sin." Kingston helped her off the floor and into the tower. Little did she know that Kingston had been tasked by Cromwell to record and feed back everything that Anne said. Anne being placed in her apartments rather than the dungeons probably gave her a false sense of security, as it couldn't be that bad, right? I imagine she gave a minuscule sigh of relief, and she was a bit shocked but also happy at the news. At 5:30 that afternoon, the name of the third man that she allegedly slept with is revealed to be her brother, George Boleyn.
What?
Anne was appointed 4 ladies by Cromwell, 4 ladies who Anne didn't like nor trust. But Cromwell needed more evidence, and one spy wasn't enough. Later that evening, Cromwell was preparing for the upcoming trials. Despite Anne being unpopular, she still had some powerful allies, which explains the imprisonment of Sir Henry Norris and George Boleyn. But Cromwell had one shot to take Anne down, and he wasn't going to take any chances. All bases had to be covered. At 10 p.m. that evening, Anne's mood is darkening. William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, pays the Queen a visit. Anne protests her innocence to Kingston. "I am the King's true wedded wife." She then asks Kingston if he knew why she was there. He simply replies with no. Anne most likely started to panic, and understandably wants to know where her supporters are, particularly her father. But like her uncle Norfolk, Thomas Boleyn distanced himself from his daughter to save his own skin. Now, from a modern viewpoint, I find it totally disgusting that Thomas basically abandoned 2 of his children to save his own life and career. I'm not a parent, but surely some sort of parental instinct would kick in? And you want to protect your children at all costs. Both Anne and George must have been terrified. Maybe not at this point, but definitely once they knew they were going to get the chop. I'm sorry, Thomas Boleyn, but you are on my gits list. I also want to point out that there is no record of any member of the Boleyn family trying to contact Anne and George while they were in the Tower, nor did they try and help or intercede on their behalf. When thinking about what she could have done to upset Henry, it is possible that Anne reflected back to the 30th of April, when she teased Henry Norris about why he had not gone through with his proposal to her cousin Madge Shelton. She said, "You look for dead men's shoes, for if aught came to the king, but good you would look to have me." Now this is potentially damning evidence, as Anne was talking about the death of the king. Even Henry's doctors would not tell him he was dying at the end of his life, so understandably Norris was shocked and denied this. If he should have any such though, he would his head were off. But now she was probably worried that her remarks might have been overheard or misconstrued. If they had, one might think that she was plotting to kill him. The Queen's ladies were deeply concerned about what was said between Anne and Norris, so much so that Anne demanded that Norris go see her chaplain John Skipp and swear for the Queen that she was a good woman. Anne must have said this out loud, as her ladies in the Tower were reporting to Kingston everything she said, and Kingston was reporting this back to Cromwell, as is evident in a letter to Cromwell from Kingston, where he said that Anne had told Mrs. Coffin, one of her ladies, how she had teased Sir Francis Weston, because he did love her kinswoman, Mrs. Shelton, and that she said he loved not his wife. He then replied he loved one in her house better than. Anne asked him who. He responded with, "It is yourself." Now, listen to me. In his defence, this was technically the right answer. It was a game of courtly love. He was flattering his queen and mistress. She was the Queen of England. Shouldn't everyone be in love with the Queen of England? And just in case there was any confusion, Madge was engaged or courting Henry Norris, but Francis Weston was flirting with her. Unfortunately, this was all the evidence that Cromwell needed, and it would be very damaging for Anne and her case. Henry was done with Anne, and he was done with the marriage. He wanted his marriage to Anne to be annulled before she was executed, so it was less messy. He tasked Thomas Cranmer with the job of finding a way of legally annulling the marriage, which was hard, as Anne had done nothing wrong. Yet, Cranmer would eventually find a loophole. It was Anne's sister, Mary. The Pope had issued a dispensation for Anne and Henry to be married in 1528, because Henry had slept with her sister Mary. She had been his mistress. But the Act of Supremacy in 1534 meant that papal dispensations were no longer valid, and as such, Henry and Anne's marriage was incestuous and invalid due to his affair with Mary. The trial of Anne Boleyn took place on the 15th of May 1536 in the Great Hall at the Tower of London. Thomas Cromwell chose the judge and jury, and the Duke of Norfolk was to preside over Anne's trial. Cromwell had set things up perfectly to go his way. One of the 26 jurors was Anne's own father, Thomas Boleyn. She did actually have some supporters in the jury, but they would have to vote the way of the king, otherwise it would be their necks on the line. Anne sat on a raised platform in the centre of the room for all to see. Commoners were expected to stand, but Anne was still Queen of England, so she was allowed to sit. About 2,000 people squeezed in to see her trial. As Anne's trial was about to start, Henry was at York Place in Whitehall. Jane Seymour, who had been absent from court the last couple of days to avoid causing gossip, was at Chelsea. If Anne was found guilty, then a cannon would fire. At 9 a.m, the Duke of Norfolk called for silence. "Gentlemen, jailer of the Tower, bring in your prisoner." Anne entered the room, followed by her 4 ladies. Eyewitnesses remarked that Anne looked in control, and the gentleman jailer had his axe turned away from Anne, as she is currently innocent. Thomas Cromwell leads the prosecution, giving it everything he's got to get her convicted. The only problem is, Anne doesn't actually know what she's being accused of. The indictment that is kept at the National Archives in Kew details Anne's charges. She is accused of adultery with 4 men, Norris, Brereton, Smeaton and Weston. The indictment also suggests that Anne had been conducting these affairs for the duration of her marriage to Henry. It also says that Anne is following daily her frail and carnal lusts, did falsely and traitorously procure kisses and touches of the king's daily and familiar servants to be her adulterers and concubines. These charges were read to Anne in court, and in total she is accused of around 20 acts of adultery. But Cromwell failed to do his homework when he fabricated these indictments, because on at least 5 occasions Anne was heavily pregnant, and on some of the other occasions she was nowhere near the man in question at the time. An hour has gone by since Anne's trial has started. She is calm and assured of her innocence. She said little, but no one to look at her would have thought her guilty. Thanks to her education, Anne was not only the men's intellectual equal, but also their superior, something that could not be said about most Tudor women. As such, the trial wasn't going Cromwell's way, which must have been infuriating for him, considering he has controlled and planned every aspect possible. The next part of the indictment is read out. Incest. The court records claim that Anne enticed her brother, alluring him with her tongue in the said George's mouth, and the said George's tongue in hers, and their eyes wide open. Anne is also accused of witchcraft. Let's be real, the charge of incest was flimsy, and probably not Cromwell's best piece of work. The evidence is a letter Anne had written to George telling him that she was pregnant. This was deliberately interpreted as Anne telling George that she was pregnant with his child. It also rested upon information that, according to Chapuis, was fed to Cromwell by George's wife Jane. Anne calmly listens to the evidence against her, and an hour later, the Duke of Norfolk sends the jury to deliberate. It did not take them long to reach a verdict. And remember, their decision was also impacted by the trial that took place 3 days earlier. It was unanimous, and Anne was found guilty of treason. She was stripped of her crown and titles. The jury most likely voted in favour of the king's wishes, so that they wouldn't be next. The Duke of Norfolk delivers the sentence. Because thou hast offended against our sovereign the king's grace in committing treason against his person, and here attainted of the same, the law of the realm is this, that thou hast deserved death, and thy judgment is that thou shalt be burnt, here within the Tower of London on the green, or else to have thy head smitten off, as the king's pleasure shall be further known. The room erupted at the news, while Anne stayed as composed as ever.
So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause.
Now, it is worth noting that when the jury decided that she was guilty, they didn't actually specify how Anne was to die, mainly because a Queen of England had never been executed before. For what Anne was accused and found guilty of, she should have been burnt or hanged, drawn and quartered. The National Archives holds the execution warrant for Anne Boleyn. What we can learn from this document is that it is Henry who chose how Anne was to die. We, moved by pity, not wishing the Lady Anne be burnt, direct the Constable of the Tower that on the green within the Tower of London, the said Anne shall have her head cut from her body. It is interesting how it says cut and not chopped. This may help explain why she was beheaded by a sword and not an axe. The document also shows us that they had no idea how a Queen of England should be executed, and that, rather scarily or eerily, Anne's execution was a template or a trial run ready for when it was the turn of Catherine Howard. Beheading by sword was a French style of execution, and it was supposed to be a cleaner, quicker, and more elegant way to go. It's almost like Henry felt guilty about giving her a more gruesome death.
Coincidence? I think not!
Anne addressed the room with dignity. I do not say I have always shown him that humility which his goodness to me merited. I confess I have had jealous fancies and suspicions of him, which I had not discretion enough and wisdom to conceal. But God knows and is my witness that I have not sinned against him in any other way. Think not I say this in the hope to prolong my life. God hath taught me how to die, and he will strengthen my faith. Now, I think Anne's speech is really telling. She's acknowledging that she knows that what she has been accused of is not really why she has been put to death, and that it is far more likely because she has failed to conform to what is expected of a wife and queen. I interpret this as Anne being an early feminist, and that the Tudor court was not ready for the female empowerment that she was bringing in as a strong-willed woman. Now, I know people are going to disagree with me in the comments and probably tell me I'm wrong. But good for you, this is my opinion, and how I interpret the statement. I feel like she's acknowledging that she could have been a bit more submissive, like Catherine, and probably she should have, but she wasn't, so... On the 16th of May 1536, the 5 men in the Tower, Lord Rochford, Norris, Smeaton, Weston, and Brereton, were told that they would be beheaded the next day. It was also on this day that Thomas Cromwell convinces Thomas Cranmer to annul Henry and Anne's marriage, despite the fact that Cranmer himself believed Anne's innocence. The marriage was annulled on the basis of some truth, just, and legitimate causes recently brought to our attention. The marriage was null and void, and had always been so. This made the Princess Elizabeth illegitimate and a bastard. She was to be a lady like her sister Mary. Henry's affair with Anne's sister Mary was used to help annul the marriage, as it would have been seen as incest, and the next day, on the 17th of May, Henry and Anne's marriage was declared invalid. Anne would go to the scaffold as the Lady Marquess of Pembroke, not the Queen of England. On the morning of the 17th, a large crowd gathered and watched as the 5 men were led out of the Tower of London and onto the scaffold. Although sentenced to hanged, drawn and quartering, they were given mercy, and their sentence was changed to beheading. It was not so honourable for one to deny guilt if they had been found guilty at a trial. So, when George finally took the stand, block, scaffold thing, he admitted to being a sinner deserving of death. Probably the exact opposite to how he actually felt. George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, was the first to be executed because he was the most senior in rank, then Weston, then Norris, then Brereton, and finally Mark Smeaton. As Mark Smeaton was last, the poor sod would have had a scaffold and block covered in blood and a blunter axe. Anne watched this unfold from the bell tower, as its windows overlooked Tower Hill. Understandably, watching these 5 innocent men die aggravated her grief. When the executions were over, a shaking Anne was returned to the lieutenant's house, where she was informed that she would die by sword, and not burnt at the stake. Lieutenant, by the way, I have mentioned this before, is the English and technically proper pronunciation of the American word lieutenant. On the 18th of May 1536, the day that Anne Boleyn should have died, Thomas Cranmer came to the Tower to hear her last confession. Anne pleaded her innocence again, and that she had never been unfaithful to her lord and husband, and that she had never offended with her body against the king. I find this really telling, as they would have taken deathbed confessions, if you like, or last confessions, really seriously, as this is their last chance to get to heaven, and the fact that Anne is still pleading innocence, and the other factors, like not actually being in the places where she was accused of being, means 100%, in my mind, she was innocent. She was just being a bit flirty. Kingston, the constable of the Tower, informed Anne that the swordsman who was coming over from France was delayed at Dover, to which Anne is thought to have said, "I thought to be dead before this time and past my pain." Kingston then replied, "It should be no pain. It was so subtle." It was at this point that Anne put her hands round her neck and laughed. "I have heard say that the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." Midday came, and the executioner had still not arrived. Anne, who had prepared herself all day to die, was told that she would now be dispatched in the morning, which meant that she mentally had to go through all of that again, which I can only imagine how exhausting that was. Because don't forget, she is trying to keep up appearances of being a most righteous queen. Something, ironically, if she was a bit more of during her reign, she might not be in the position that she was in now. Cranmer issued a dispensation so Henry could marry Jane Seymour, because he was marrying yet another relative. Henry spent his evening with Jane at Strand, who was already acting like a queen, much how like Anne had with Catherine. Understandably, Anne could not sleep. She spent her last night on earth praying and talking with her ladies. Her mental state once again was unstable. Again, a totally normal reaction, in my opinion. She was quiet and calm, but then she would be cheerful and jokey. coming up with nicknames for her once she had been beheaded, such as Queen Anne Lackhead. I don't know if coming to terms is the best phrasing, but she essentially was coming to terms with her situation, and she believed that her execution was justified for her cruel treatment of the Lady Mary.
I'm fine. I'm fine. I don't know why it's coming out all loud and squeaky, because really, I'm fine.
Everyone in Anne's apartments were awake at 2 a.m. on the 19th of May. The once Queen was cheerful, laughing, and joking with her ladies. Sir William Kingston notes that Anne's mood flips between despair and hope that something or someone, maybe the king, will call off the execution, and that this was all a test. I have seen many men and also women executed, and all they have been in great sorrow, but to my knowledge, this lady has much joy and pleasure in death. I wonder if Anne was slightly in denial. If she was as innocent as she looks to be, in my opinion, and she would know the truth, then I can imagine it would be difficult to seriously wrap your head round it. The men had public executions. However, Anne was going to become the first person to officially be executed within the Tower's walls, as she was going to have a private execution. Cromwell had the scaffold built quickly, and Anne to be gone just as quickly before Henry changed his mind. At 5 a.m, Anne starts to get dressed ready for her execution. Anne usually wore extravagant, colourful French gowns fitting of her status as queen. However, today, she wore a red kirtle, that's an underdress, with a matching petticoat. Petticoats were common among peasants. Everything Anne wore was symbolic. This was her last opportunity for a PR stunt and to fix her reputation. So Anne was trying to come across humble by wearing the peasant's petticoat. Red is also significant for being a colour of martyrdom. Her outer gown was grey or black. I personally like to think that it was black. I think it would have gone better with the red, and I feel like Anne would have known that, being the fashionista that she is, or was. Grey or black was also the colour of piety and sobriety at court, so again it's fitting for this image that she is trying to portray. Her robe was trimmed with fur with a low square neck, and from her shoulders flowed a long white cape. At 7:30, someone, intentional or not we do not know, left the gates open at the Tower of London, and between 1,000 to 3,000 people crowded in to watch the now not so private execution. Amongst the crowd was her uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, Gregory Cromwell, the son of Thomas, and her stepson, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond and Somerset, who would die a month later, and Anne would be accused of poisoning him.
Right.
Fitzroy's appearance at the event was a stark reminder to everyone that Henry VIII could father sons, the one thing Anne failed to provide him. I've been banging on about Anne's composure, but we have more evidence here to testify how brave she was at facing what lied ahead. Sir William Kingston told Anne to make her final preparations, to which she tells him, "Acquit yourself of your charge, for I have long been prepared." She then proceeded to give Kingston her purse so she could pay the executioner. How charming that she has to pay for an executioner that I'm sure she didn't want.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity, and the gumption.
Anne's nemesis Chapuis even remarked she was braver than a lion. At 8:15, Anne was led by Sir William Kingston from her apartments through Cold Harbour Gate to the scaffold at the other end of the White Tower. Today that spot is just outside the Jewel House. Anne, along with her 4 ladies and Kingston, were met by 200 yeomen of the King's Guard, her chaplain, and more guards. It is said that the crowd went silent as Anne approached the scaffold. Understandably, from the lack of sleep, she looked exhausted and dazed, but she was equally stunning. It is thought that she approaches the scaffold and that she is looking around in hopes of seeing a messenger carrying a royal pardon. She would be thoroughly disappointed. At 9:20, Kingston helps Anne climb the steps to the scaffold. Her ladies are weeping, the executioner looks uncomfortable, and the sword has been concealed from Anne under a pile of straw to not freak her out. 5 minutes later, Anne asks for permission to speak. An eyewitness account says that Anne is smiling and had a cheerful demeanour, and in a firm voice she says, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die according to law, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I come here only to die, and thus to yield myself humbly to the will of the King, my Lord. And if, in my life, I did ever offend the King's grace, surely with my death I do now atone. I come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused, as I know full well that aught I say in my defence doth not appertain to you. I pray and beseech you all, good friends, to pray for the life of the King, my sovereign lord, and yours, who is one of the best princes on the face of the earth, who has always treated me so well that better could not be, wherefore I submit to death and good will, humbly asking pardon of all the world. If any person will meddle with my cause, I require them to judge the best. Thus I take my leave of the world and of you, and I heartily desire you all to pray for me. O Lord, have mercy on me. To God I commend my soul." Some in the crowd got tearful. When Anne is invited to confess her truth, she replies, "I know I shall have no pardon, but they shall know no more from me." Anne then turned to her ladies and begged their pardon for any harshness towards them, and she gave Lady Lee, Margaret Wyatt, her prayer book, which still survives and is at Hever Castle. The swordsman takes off his shoes so Anne won't hear him approach from behind. She removes her headdress and unclasps her necklace, while a lady hands her a linen cap, in which she tucks her hair inside to ensure a swift end. At 9 a.m, the executioner asks Anne for forgiveness for what he is about to do. She kneels and starts her prayers. "Jesu, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." The crowd goes to their knees. Her eyes are bandaged. The swordsman instructs his assistant to distract Anne with a noise. He swings the sword above his head twice to gain momentum, and her head is off with one strike. Her head falls onto the straw and people wept. Despite not being light, the executioner lifted her head, crying in a heavy French accent, "So perish all the king's enemies." While her head is in the air, her eyes and lips move. To our scientific minds, a natural shock reaction to the nervous system after decapitation. To the Tudors, a supernatural-like event of a woman who was praying after death. One of Anne's ladies picks up Anne's bloody head and covers it in a linen cloth. Her other 3 ladies were upset and refused any man to touch Anne's body. The 3 of them together carried Anne away. Kingston noted that the Queen died boldly. At 9:05, Henry would have heard the firing of the cannons that announced the death of the once Queen. As soon as the cannons sounded, Henry boards his barge and travels to see Jane. Upon receiving the news of Anne's death, Jane appeared unfazed, probably because she would be preparing for her own wedding only days later. While it had taken Anne 7 years to become queen, Jane had accomplished it in just under 7 months. Inside the Queen's chambers, Anne Boleyn's falcon badge had been replaced by Jane's symbol, a phoenix ascending from a castle engulfed in flames, surrounded by Tudor roses. An hour later, her body is laid to rest in an old arrow chest from the Tower's weapons store. Lady Lee Margaret Wyatt was a chief mourner. Her body was stripped of its jewellery and clothes, which Henry passed on to his new wife-to-be, Jane Seymour. Here, love, have my dead ex's jewellery, there you go. Merry Christmas. Anne Boleyn was reunited with her brother, George, at St. Peter ad Vincula. Few mourned her passing, and yet within 2 weeks, ballads were circulating, portraying Anne as a much-wronged heroine. On the anniversary of her death every year, on the 19th of May, an unidentified bouquet of red roses is discreetly delivered to the Tower. These flowers are meant to be placed on the very spot where Anne was laid to rest. In conclusion, Anne Boleyn's fall from grace is a gripping tale of ambition, politics, and intrigue into the Tudor court. It's a story that has fascinated people for centuries. We've explored the key events and characters that led to her dramatic downfall. Her legacy endures as a testament to the ever-shifting sands of power and the enduring mysteries of history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of my favourite Tudor consorts. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, for more historical content. And don't forget to leave your thoughts and comments down below, and as always, have a wonderful day.